Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest installment in our on-running series, PPE in a Time of Pandemic. Today, I am delighted to be joined by Professors Joshua Cohen of the University of Berkeley and Apple University, and Matt Zwolinski of the University of San Diego. And they're going to talk with me about labor, exploitation, and the future of work post-pandemic. Joshua, if I could start with you, I'd like to ask you a question about your recent paper on good jobs, which is a fantastic paper. I commend it to everyone. You can find it on the MIT Future of Work website. So in this paper, you distinguish several dimensions along which a job might be good. Yeah. Some of these features, which you call standard goods, contribute to the goodness of a job by enhancing one's life outside of work. So could you say a bit more about what these features are and about how they stand to contribute to the value of one's life when you're not on the clock?
Yeah. So thanks very much for the invitation to do this. It's a pleasure to do it, pleasure to do it with Matt. And I'm delighted to see the names of some of the people who I'm seeing in chat, some friends and former students and like that. So it's terrific to be here. So in the paper, as you say, I distinguish what I, for lack of a better term, I call standard goods from a bunch of other good-making features of good jobs. And let me preface the answer to the helpful question you've asked in two ways. First, a lot of my thinking about this issue about what makes a job a good job actually came from, I mean, I've thought about these issues for a long time, but I spent a huge amount of time over a period of about 4 or 5 years in factories and observing, mostly factories in China, observing people doing work that I didn't think of as being such great work. And so a lot of my thinking about this came from reflection on what exactly was it that I thought were the absent characteristics that were producing this response to the work that I was observing people doing. And this is thousands of hours in these places. So when you go to the literature that talks about the idea of good jobs, there are a few things that are focused on. In the literature, I mean, Daron Acemoglu wrote a piece a long time ago about it's the good job stupid or something like that. And Danny Roderick and Chuck Sable have written about good jobs externalities, which is something that we'll come back to later on. And Zeynep Tone has written on good jobs. And all of them focus, when they talk about good jobs, on what I call these standard goods. And the standard goods that I mention are compensation, decent level of compensation, stability of employment, health and safety, and then development opportunities over the course of a career at work. So not just a job, but you've got a career at work. And the way I was thinking about those, aside from just having a list of them, I'm a philosopher, and so you can't just have a list. You got to have some story about what's on the list. And I thought of them. What leads people to focus on those is because they are thinking of the features that make a job a good job, principally as the features that of the job that bring benefits outside when you're not at work. So compensation, that's kind of the obvious one. The spirit must be made flesh, and this is you're getting some flesh by doing the job. Or health and safety, it's important, for that you have a healthy and safe workplace so that the rest of your life goes okay. So I was thinking of these, if you think of work in a kind of an instrumental way, it's something that you do in order to improve your life outside of work, then these are all the 4 features that I mentioned. The standard goods are those features. Now, just one last point on this, which is, I put aside for the purposes of the paper the important idea, which you get, for example, in the encyclical Rerum Novarum, that there are standards of natural justice that focus on what's the appropriate or fitting level of compensation. So the level of compensation isn't just a means to the end of living well outside of work. There's also a recognition of the dignity of the work that you're doing by giving an appropriate or fitting level of compensation. And so, but it's an important idea, but I put it to the side for the purposes of the paper. So that's the kind of thing I have in mind.
So aside from the standard goods, in the paper you also mentioned 3 other features that are characteristic of good jobs. So you mentioned voice, purpose, and pleasure in the work itself. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little about the 3. And in particular, I'm interested to hear about the notion of purpose. Because it seems possible for a person to have a job in which they take pleasure in the work itself, but where the work ultimately serves no purpose. I mean, I sometimes worry that my own job might be like that. So I'm kind of interested to hear, what is it for a job to serve a purpose? Is it important for one's job to serve a purpose, or is it enough for one to believe that it serves a purpose?
You don't really think that your job doesn't serve any purpose, do you?
No, of course not.
Good. Okay, good. Yeah. I don't want to get distracted from our topic, but that's not true. So let me just go through them and I'll land on purpose, the 3 others. So voice. So first of all, there are lots of forms of, quote, worker voice, unquote, ranging from unions to works councils, even less formal arrangements to, Isabel Ferraris, Belgian sociologist, has written powerfully on the idea of the bicameral firm. And I'm agnostic for the purposes of the, I'm sorry, Harriet says that she does take seriously that her job serves no valuable purpose, and I don't care. Valuable purpose is another matter. I was just talking about purpose. I got a low bar here, Harriet. So I was agnostic for the purpose of the paper about what the form of voice is. And I think there are 2 reasons that voice is important. First of all, because voice has an instrumental importance with respect to the protection of those standard goods that I mentioned before, the compensation, et cetera. That's one reason. And the second reason is more intrinsic, that I think that voice protects against, subjection to arbitrary authority. And this is a little bit different from the story that Liz Anderson tells in her argument about private government, because her argument about private government, which is fine, there's no criticism here, it's just a distinction. Her argument about private government is about the legitimacy of the authority exercised over you at work. This is really not about legitimacy. This is in the space of, what makes the job good. And so the absence of a demeaning subjection to arbitrary authority makes the job good. Second feature is this idea of pleasure in the work itself. And I get that phrase from William Morris, the British socialist designer, who says that the true incentive to useful and happy labor is pleasure in the work itself. And the thought that I develop in the piece is that pleasure in the work itself depends on some elements of the complexity of the work. And I distinguish a few dimensions of complexity. So there's, is there variety, like job, the kind of thing that job rotation gives you? Is there imagination in the work? Is there judgment that's required in the work? And is there some kind of collaboration? So those things are all dimensions of the complexity of the work. So the work, for example, is less routine. If you distinguish between, if you're thinking in manufacturing, you distinguish between the work of assembly and work in a repair room. Work in a repair room requires more judgment and discretion. It's less routine. And the idea here is analogous to an idea that's developed in the what's called the job characteristic theory. This is Oldman and Hackman, which is that work that has these characteristics that make for complexity and pleasure in the work itself, make the work more highly motivating. Okay, so that's the voice and pleasure in the work itself. And then there's the issue of purpose. So David Graeber wrote this, I think, very good book about what he calls bullshit jobs. And bullshit jobs are jobs that are understood. It's subjective. It's understood by the person who's doing the job as being pointless. And he thinks that about, I don't know, 40% of work is bullshit. That seemed a little bit of a stretch to me. And just to continue with the coprophilic language, they're opposed to shit jobs. So shit jobs are just ones that pay bad. But they have a purpose. The bullshit jobs are ones where it's like, the world would be no different, except maybe better if you weren't doing the job. So I was thinking, like Graeber, that purpose is important, but I was thinking of purpose less subjectively. So let me give an example that I mentioned in the paper. So take the work that went into building Central Park. There were thousands of people who were involved, directed by Olmsted, the designer, in doing the work that went into building Central Park. I think of that work as having served this incredibly important purpose in building this amazing public good. But, people were busting up rocks and, and he was a taskmaster, Olmsted. So it wasn't in other ways great work, but I do think it served an important purpose. And I guess I think partly because of what Central Park is about, it's work that the people doing the work, whatever they thought while they were doing it, was work that they could, if they thought about it, they reflected on it and think, well, it was good, at least to this extent, that I was doing something that advanced this important goal. So less subjective than Graeber, but, insufficient to make the job good. I don't know if that alleviates any of the perplexity, but there you have it.
Thank you. So Matt, maybe I can bring you in here with a broader question. So say that I would like to have a good job of the sort that Joshua describes. That would be good for me. But do I also have a stake in whether or not my neighbor has a good job? And should I strive for a society in which both my neighbor and I have better chances of securing good jobs?
Yeah, good. Well, first, let me echo Joshua's gratitude to you for organizing this and inviting me here, and his joy at seeing so many familiar faces in the room here. So it's great to speak with so many wonderful and really sharp people. So I'm looking forward to this conversation. Yeah, I think we could definitely say you have a stake in other people having good jobs. I mean, if you think, as I sometimes encourage my students to do, right? If you think about the variety of goods and services that make your life go well, right? The vast majority of these things are produced by jobs that other people do, right? We're far from self-sufficient creatures as human beings. In the market, I encourage people to think of the market as a kind of vast web of interconnected mutual cooperation. And on that lens, I think there are strong reasons, both of a moral and a prudential nature, to want one's trading partners in that network to be treated well. So that's the easy answer, right? Yeah, it's perfectly reasonable and also perfectly costless to say, gosh, I wish everybody had a good job. Where things get trickier, I think, is in saying what ought to be done to make that happen. And in particular, what we're willing to sacrifice from a social perspective in order to pay for those good jobs, right? I think there probably are some cases, maybe a lot of cases, where good jobs are a positive sum gain, right? So maybe there's a kind of efficiency wage that leads to higher output on the part of the workers that you're paying. Or maybe there are cases where you make an investment in workers and that kind of pays for itself in terms of positive spillovers for the rest of society. But I think in a lot of cases, we're going to have to make some kind of trade-off. And those trade-offs, of course, are going to be harder to assess than just judging that, yeah, good jobs are good. It'd be better if more people had them. They're especially hard to assess a priori, right? So for instance, it's not clear to me, yes or no, whether we should regard good jobs, for instance, as something that employers have a moral obligation to supply, rather than just something that it would be good if they did more of. It's also not clear what kinds of public policies, if we want to go that route, what kinds of public policies are going to be best suited towards promoting good jobs. So for instance, one of the policies that Josh mentions in his paper is a minimum wage. And I'm more skeptical of Josh about both the efficiency and the fairness of minimum wage policies. But even if you support them, right, it's clear that they have some kind of social cost, right? So one of the questions we have to address in thinking about these issues is whether and on what margin, I guess, it's better to have more good jobs, even if perhaps that means some increase in the number of people who don't have any jobs at all. I don't have a particular stake on all those trade-offs. It's just the fact that there are trade-offs, I think, is important to bear in mind, and those are going to be tricky to deal with.
So maybe if we continue plumbing this vein, so in your work, you've argued that libertarian thought can offer greater support to certain projects of social justice than perhaps traditionally supposed. And so to return to something else that Josh said, I wonder, on hearing what Josh had to say about the role of voice in good jobs, what you think as a, to use your fantastic expression, bleeding heart libertarian, about unionization and other mechanisms that facilitate communication from the shop floor to the head office.
Yeah, good. No, this is something I've actually been thinking a lot about lately. I'm finishing a book on the history of libertarian thought right now. And if you look at sort of the libertarians that we all know and either love or hate, right, the giants of the 20th century, people like, Nozick or Rothbard or Rand. Libertarianism has this reputation as a kind of anti-union view. And I think that's not an unwarranted reputation, especially if you look at sort of the more popular libertarian organization and movements, right? So if you look at like the things that are published by organizations like the Foundation for Economic Education or the Cato Institute, the majority of that stuff is kind of anti-union. It's pointing out the problems or the costs of unions. You see the same thing too if you look at more intellectual libertarians like Friedrich Hayek. But really, if you go back to the 19th century, in both Britain and the United States, you actually get a surprisingly different picture of the relationship between libertarianism and organized labor. So at that time, I think there was considerable skepticism, a surprising amount of skepticism among libertarians about both the efficiency and the morality of just wage labor in general. There were a lot of libertarians who thought that wage labor was this transitory phase that we were going through, and the sooner we can get over that, the better. You see that view, for instance, in Britain, in the writings of Thomas Hodgkin. You see that in the United States in the writings of people like Lysander Spooner. And there's this view that's shared by those individuals that part of what was wrong with wage labor was the fact that in the way that it happened to be organized in those economic systems, it involved the massive use of state power in a way that benefited the capital owning classes at the expense of labor. And so those libertarians saw unions as a way in which individuals could use their natural right of free association to improve their situation. And that was seen as completely morally unproblematic and also just an important part of the market process, right? Where the various factors of production bargain in order to receive their fair share. So that was the kind of common libertarian position that started to change toward the end of the 19th century, first in Britain and then later in the United States. Kind of started in Britain with the emergence of what was called the new unionism. And there were two things going on that kind of led to that transition, one of which was the increasing association between the labor movement and kind of socialist agitation. So libertarians were vehemently opposed to socialism to the extent that labor unions came to be linked with that. They tended to reject both those things. And the second was the use of coercion, both on the individual level, right? Both on the part of like individual unions or union members, and as libertarians thought it, violence through the intermediary of the state, right? So libertarians, supported and still, I think, to some degree, support unions to the extent that they're voluntary. And what they really have a problem with is where there are state efforts to strengthen unions by means of coercion, which is kind of a straightforward point and kind of not. Like in theory, it's simple enough. In practice, it gets really, really complicated. So like, for instance, I'll close with this. Like you might think that libertarians should support, and most of them probably do support, right to work laws, right? These laws that give people the right to work without having to join a union. It's actually, once you start thinking about it, it's actually a lot more complicated than that, right? Because it looks like what right to work laws do is they suppress the ability of employers to enter into voluntary agreements with unions such that, right, like everybody who works in this place is going to have to join a union. If that's a voluntary agreement, and you think as a libertarian that people ought to be able to make basically whatever kind of voluntary arrangements they want, then suppressing those kind of voluntary agreements through the use of state coercion looks like an illegitimate thing to do. So it's messy.
Thank you. And a lovely example. So this is a PPE in a time of pandemic series. So I'm going to ask Joshua a question about the pandemic and work during the pandemic. So the pandemic's altered our notions of what work is, quote unquote, essential in a way that might suggest that which jobs are essential is actually highly contextual. So grocery delivery pre-pandemic, for example, was a luxury service, but now it's a mainstay for many families. So because one of the features of a good job on your account is purpose, if purpose is related to essentialness and that's contextual, then what does that mean for which jobs are good and which aren't?
I think it follows from what you said that distinction is contextual. I agree. I think it's a really interesting point, and the examples that you give are interesting. And I haven't thought about it deeply enough to really be settled in a response. But my instinct is to say that some delivery jobs have been, well, I'm tempted to say shown to be better jobs. It's not they've shown, they've changed, the nature of the job has changed because who you're providing delivery services to has changed. So what you now see is that the delivery job that you were doing that was antecedently providing a luxury service is now providing a kind of, very important benefit to a much wider range of people. I think that if I can, to be maybe, I don't know, be a little too moralistic about it. I mean, it sort of elevates, I think it does elevate the job. And I wouldn't be surprised now in a sort of David Graeber spirit about how people see the work that they're doing. I wouldn't be surprised if there were people who thought that better of the work that they were doing. They didn't think that the delivery work that they were doing was so pointless because they no longer have the thought, why don't these assholes go and shop for themselves? Why am I doing this? And now they're all, so they're doing something different. And I think that does, again, to put it in this overly elevated way, it does elevate the purpose of the job. That's sort of where I am now, but maybe I'll change my mind about that. If I could just add one point, because listening to Matt was making me feel intellectually lazy because he was talking a lot about trade-offs, and as he, I'm sure, noticed in the thing that I wrote, I don't talk about them barely. I talk about barely at all. I mean, and by deliberately, I didn't talk about them at all. And the reason for that truncation was that I guess I was thinking, before you start thinking about trade-offs, you want to have some sense about what the good qualities are. And I think there's an under explicitness and under appreciation of the range of good qualities aside from the standard good. So what my main purpose was to elevate those good-making qualities that are often buried. I also think the trade-offs are less arch than Matt may, although I'm sure we'll get back to that. Anyway, that's the reason for, it's absolutely true in the piece that I did. There's almost nothing about trade-offs except at the very end, but that's the reason for it.
So Matt, one species of job that seems paradigmatically not good, at least on accounts like Joshua's, is sweatshop work. Yet in your published papers on exploitation, you've argued that although these jobs may not be good, government intervention and boycotting can't be justified in order to eradicate sweatshop labor conditions. So why, on your account, should we be wary of intervening in sweatshop conditions?
Right. So let me just first say I didn't intend any criticism of Joshua's.
No, I didn't think. Yeah, I didn't think you did. I just wanted to. Yes.
The axiology is prior to the economics here, so I thought it was a beautiful exploration of what you were trying to explore. So I appreciate it. Yeah, on the sweatshop issue, I think it's probably too strong to say that government intervention and boycotts are never justified. I think the point I want to make is a point of caution, right? You need to be careful about using them. And the basic reason you need to be careful about using them is that often those interventions have unintended consequences that wind up setting the interests of the people you're trying to help. So in my view, the most important fact to keep sight of in thinking about how to deal with sweatshop labor is that sweatshops are a creature of desperate poverty. Sweatshops exist and they are able to attract people to work in them only because those people lack sufficiently better options. And they lack better options because they and the economy in which they operate are desperately poor. But why does that matter, right? Like, imagine, thought experiment, imagine you could just snap your fingers, right? And instantly eliminate sweatshops from the developing world in a heartbeat. I think that would be a horrible thing to do. And the reason that it would be a horrible thing to do is that it would do nothing to eliminate or even mitigate the poverty that drove people to sweatshops in the first place. All it would do is going to be take away the option that they regard as their best choice among a small set of very bad options. In other words, you'd be making their poverty even worse rather than curing it. So, so that's the worry, right? That's the thing that we have to bear in mind in the background. Now, of course, people who want to boycott or regulate sweatshops don't want to eliminate the sweatshop jobs, right? They just want to improve them. They want to apply pressure on the firms in order to generate improved conditions for workers. And that's fine. It's a tricky business to pull off, right? Because often, usually maybe those improvements cost money. Improvements in working conditions cost something. And the worry is that if you increase the cost of firms too much, right, you're going to undermine the incentive they have to do business in that location at all, right? If it costs as much to employ people in the developing world as it does in the United States, then you just employ people in the United States instead, or they go to the next country where they're not regulated so heavily. So again, it's not an absolute bar to intervention. It's just a caution that in doing so, you need to be sensitive to the incentive of the economic actors involved and not undermine what is a mutually beneficial partnership between employers and laborers, even in the urge or the desire to make that partnership more favorable to one of those parties than it currently is.
Thank you. So let's keep talking about incentives and interventions to improve labor conditions. So Josh, as you point out in your paper, although good jobs might be good for those that have them, they might not benefit employers to the same degree. So we might expect for good jobs to be undersupplied by the market. Should something be done about this? And if so, what policies could be adopted that might foster the supply of good jobs?
I do think that there are, and I take this phrase from Roderick and Sable, good jobs, externalities. And I think Matt was alluding to this idea earlier, or maybe even more than alluding to it, referring to this idea earlier when he talked about other people having a stake and people having good jobs. And I'll say something about what I think some of the externalities are and what some of the policies are. But before getting there, I just want to, it's related to the issue you're raising is related to the previous question. And so one of the things that we did, myself and a group of co-investigators did in this work that we were doing on factory labor, and I won't go into the details of the places that we were studying for NDA reasons, but the thing that we were particularly interested in studying was high factory turnover, and which was a huge issue in U.S. manufacturing early in the 20th century. Sumner Slichter, who was the leading labor economist in the United States for the first half of the 20th century, wrote his PhD thesis on the turnover of factory labor. It was around 1920. And so in the places that we were looking at, what you see is the average turnover rate per week was about 6%. 6% per week. Ford was higher than that before the $5 day, but 6% is pretty high. And you might think that, Jesus, how could you run an organization producing goods with 6% of people leaving every week? Well, I have some economist in me that says companies are not in the business of leaving money on the table. And so if it really, really were a gigantic problem, they do something different about it. It's not always the right way to think, but so what we did was we spent a huge amount of time trying to identify costs of turnover. So these are jobs that are incredibly routine, boring work. When Harriet says in chat, she just doesn't want to do shit work. She doesn't want to work in one of these places. I mean, big time. Incredibly routine work, 20-second cycle time on these assembly jobs, 25-30-second cycle time. And so there were two things that we found. One was that we were looking, so these are minimum wage jobs, incredibly routine. One of the things that we found was that in higher turnover weeks, once a month on payday, after there's a particularly high turnover, there's a drop in quality. That is, more units fail tests. And then we also found that when there were particularly high turnover weeks, again, once a month on payday, the units that are produced that week end up with higher rates of failure in the field. So they escape from the factory, they end up out and sold, but chances of the unit failing in the field are higher. So the humanist's instinct to think that at 6% turnover a week, you can't really run an organization turns out to have a little bit to it. Not as much as maybe the humanist thinks, but more than the industrial engineer thinks, where the industrial engineer is the person who thinks, I can make this these operations mistake proof. Poka-yoke is the Japanese in operations for mistake proofness. So it turns out not to be right. So there's some attenuation, just going back to Matt's previous one, there's some attenuation of the assumption that there are not gains that can be had from improving the conditions. Okay, so but those are not good jobs externalities. Those are good jobs internalities. That's for the firm and for the employees. So the good jobs externalities, I think if you think of good jobs in the way that I've been thinking about it, it's good for democracy. I think it's good for innovation, and it's good for productivity in the economy wide. Not just for the firm itself. So I think they're underprovided by markets. And then there are a few different things that you can do. First of all, I think minimum wage laws do drive firms off the low road of supplying low wage jobs. And that it provides an incentive for the firms to do kind of industrial upgrades, process upgrades, productivity upgrades that enables them to pay for the job. So that minimum wage is one thing. Social protections that give people alternatives to feeling that they have to accept Matt was saying, these shitty jobs. Active labor market policies, everybody's favorite is, Denmark flex security, active labor market policies that give people, training, retraining in between jobs, make it easier for them to leave jobs. And then I think R&D spending, a public policy around R&D spending that helps incumbent firms to innovate who would otherwise be stuck. And also industrial policies that create opportunities for new firms. I think, just a simple example of this in the case of the United States was that when you increased the miles per gallon expectations on automobiles in around 2007, what happened was that created a market opportunity for a whole bunch of firms to come in and create what turned out to be decent jobs. So those things, minimum wage laws, social protections, active labor market policies, R&D spending, and then some kinds of industrial policy. Those are how you capture the good jobs.
So given the increasing automation of work, even with all of these policies to secure better jobs, we might be facing a future in which many jobs just disappear and can't be maintained. So Matt, one of the things you argue for in your work is universal basic income. So could you briefly tell us what that is and why you support it?
Yeah, sure. So a basic income, definitions of basic income vary for reasons that we'll see shortly, but essentially a basic income is defined by two key features, right? The first is that it involves cash transfers rather than in-kind payments, like food stamps or something like that. The second is that eligibility for those transfers is universal in some sense, at least in the sense that it doesn't depend on whether one is currently working, or usually even on whether one is willing to work. Beyond those 2 points of agreement, there's a lot of variation among UBI proposals. So for instance, some of them issue payments to families, others to individuals. Some issue payments only to adults, others include children. Some of them, and this is a major point of contention among kind of left-wing and right-wing advocates of a UBI, some of them are intended to be added on top of existing transfer programs, whereas others, like for instance, Charles Murray's proposal in our hands, is meant to be a substitute for a range of existing social welfare policies. And of course, there's the big issue of like how big the UBI is supposed to be, how much cash is actually going to be transferred. So different people support UBIs for different kinds of reasons, and the reasons they have often do a lot to shape the form of the particular UBI that they endorse. For my own part, my support for a UBI comes from two distinct sources, two idiosyncratic and distinct sources, perhaps. One is a kind of left libertarian George's commitment to the idea that the raw materials of the earth are the common property of humanity. And the other is a kind of Hayekian commitment to individual liberty, understood in some kind of neo-Republican sense of independence from the arbitrary will of others. And I think if you put those together in some weird amalgam, you get support for a relatively modest form of UBI, right? The goal of which is more sufficientarian than egalitarian, and which would function as a supplement to paid labor rather than as a permanent substitute for it, right? So it wouldn't be designed to cope with the mass elimination of jobs due to automation.
So one worry about UBI as a response to the increasing automation of labor, and one that dovetails nicely with the discussion that we've been having about good jobs, is that while UBI replaces one of the features of a job, the monetary contribution part, it can't substitute for other features of work that help to contribute to a flourishing life. So Matt, I'm interested in hearing about whether you think purposeful work is important for human well-being, or at least for the well-being of many humans, and do you anticipate problems of well-being arising as a result of the mass redundancy of labor?
Yeah, good. I mean, so that's a nice point. I mean, it's a point that's often made by critics of the UBI. It's a point that's especially often made by conservative critics of the UBI, right? That work is about more than just a paycheck, right? It has a meaning in people's lives that can't be substituted for simply by giving people money. I think that's right. At the same time, I think it's also important not to overstate that argument. Work is an important source of meaning in people's life, but it's also a mistake to assume that all work is equivalent to paid employment in the labor market, right? Which is an equivocation that very often gets made in these conversations. So look, people can engage in meaningful work as an independent artist, by making videos for YouTube, by raising a family, right? Those are all valid sources of meaning and in a sense of work in a person's life. Now, our culture, makes a lot of assumptions about the kind of work that makes for a good life, and I think those assumptions, whether they're warranted or not, ultimately, they have a kind of independent effect on the viability of kind of non-traditional forms of work. And I think those assumptions are pretty deeply embedded and kind of slow to change. But I do want to caution against the observation that work is an important, against the jump, I guess, from the observation that work is an important source of meaning in people's life to the conclusion that any policy like a UBI that disincentivizes paid labor to some degree is therefore going to undermine that source of meaning. That said, I don't think that the paid labor market is going anywhere with or without a UBI. It's true, it's kind of obviously true that robots are going to do a lot of work that was previously done by humans in the next century or so. But I think if past technological developments are anything to go by, and of course there are people who think this time is really different. I think those problems are going to be transitional problems more than permanent ones, and that the goal of a UBI should be to help people cope with the disruptions that are caused by automation in the same way that like 30, 40 years ago, you might have wanted to help people cope with the disruptions that are caused by globalization, right? So I think globalization is a nice and accurate analogy for what we're going to become seeing in automation. If at some point in the future, the robots really do start making everything we want for free, and there's no more need for human labor, then we can have a different conversation about how to deal with that problem. But speaking for myself, I think that's a problem I would be very, very happy to have.
Time for one more, and then I'll hand things over to Ryan. So let's continue talking about, boredom out of work and boredom in work. And this is a question for Joshua. So Joshua, you acknowledge that some jobs possessed of social purpose will nonetheless prove boring and repetitive in practice. So this reminded me of a suggestion made by Adam Smith, who identifies work-related tedium as a moral and social challenge for advanced economies. The pin factory might be a modern excellence, but life on the factory floor is mind-numbing nonetheless. So in partial response, Smith argues that the state should provide the laborer with an education in order that the laborer might be furnished with ideas with which they can amuse themselves. So it's all very well to have a job with a purpose, but should further social provision be made for those with tedious but socially necessary jobs?
I read that quotation from Adam Smith about ideas with which he can amuse himself. And there was something, lots of things that Adam Smith says I think are amazing and compelling. I found that one kind of repugnant. So here are a few thoughts about it, especially the idea that you provide people with an education so they can amuse themselves. I don't know. Maybe I think people are pretty good at amusing themselves, even if you don't. So there were three things that occurred to me about that, the question and the comment. The first is that the idea that education is either about enabling people to succeed in the labor market or providing people with amusements, like, misses a couple of important things about education. This is sort of a sidebar point to the main thrust of it, but I just feel the need to say it. I mean, aside from the fact that education is, you learn shit from education. I mean, it's good for that reason, but also, I mean, there's a long tradition of thinking of an important purpose of education as involving a kind of, civic preparation. Education is foundational for collective self-government, for democracy, and for a whole bunch of reasons, many of them historical, Smith may not have been thinking about that, but I think that's an important purpose of education besides labor market participation or providing people with amusements. Secondly, I do think there's something. There was a thought that was suggested to me by looking at that quotation. And I do think of great public goods as a form of social provision that are available to everybody. I don't know if they provide amusements, but they are important goods. And again, I mentioned the case earlier in the discussion of purpose about Central Park. What Olmsted said about Central Park was that its purpose was to supply to the hundreds of thousands of tired workers a specimen of God's handiwork that shall be to them inexpensively what a month or two in the Adirondacks or White Mountains is at great cost to those in easier circumstances. In other words, you bring the experience, instead of moving people to the Adirondacks, you would bring the experience of natural beauty that's available only to some people, you make it available to everyone. And that's not providing people with an amusement. In fact, Olmsted himself was very dismissive of the idea that what you want to do is provide bread and circuses for people, as if so what he thought was that there was a universal human interest in the experience of natural beauty, and that the great thing about Central Park was that it provided that universally important human experience to people who wouldn't otherwise have it. Just a footnote here, since there are lots of philosophers in the audience, I think that idea that there's this universal interest in this experience of human beauty, that people need to be exposed to it in order to awaken that interest. It has probably some resonance with John Stuart Mill and ideas about higher quality pleasures. Well, the great book Cotton Kingdom, which Olmsted published in England in 1861 to keep the British from fighting on the side of the South in the Civil War, was dedicated to John Stuart Mill. So there's some, it's a, then just a last point, which is, and this goes back to the thing that I was saying earlier about the good jobs internalities. The premise of the question is that there are these jobs that are just, they're, as you put it, not mind-numbing. I'm sure there are some, as Michael Walzer used to say, somebody's got to clean up the garbage, or whatever it was, some phrase like that. But there are lots of jobs that are boring, tedious, repetitive jobs that don't have to be. That's a job for designers to make them, and the important point there, just as the job of Central Park was a design job, the designer, it's a job for designers. And this goes back to the axiology before economics phrase that Matt used earlier. That's the kind of thing that you're going to do as a designer, not if, but only if you appreciate the values that you're missing out on, the good jobs values that you're missing out on. So I think trade-offs are real and important. It's also a little bit too easy to naturalize, necessitize, if I can make that word up, the existing trade-offs, rather than to think of them as an object of attenuation through design. So those are a few different reactions to that question. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And this is a wonderful moment to pass things over to Ryan for audience questions.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you so much. We have many questions, probably more than we'll be able to get to, but let me start. It's a question for you, Josh, and I'm going to sort of try to smush together some questions that were on the same topic. So we have a question from Emily and from Jennifer. They're both raising an interesting point. So you distinguished, when talking about the good making features of jobs, there was the distinction between the sort of standard or like instrumental good things, and there were the things like voice and purpose and whatnot. And both Emily and Jen were curious about there being like a third category, which was the moral value of your job. And Emily was interested in jobs that maybe are valuable for moral reasons, that have like positive moral value, using the example of like working for the NHS in the UK. And Jen, on the other hand, was concerned about jobs that maybe are very good and that they have a purpose, they meet all of the criteria, but they're bad jobs morally, and that they make life overall less good for society as a whole. And her example was something like Facebook, or you could imagine maybe working for the tobacco industry or something like that.
Yeah.
So it's a question just about whether you think there's that, what role, is there a moral value to or a moral dimension to these jobs?
So I guess it's a great question, and I don't have an answer to it that's as good as the question. I guess I was thinking of that dimension of moral importance, if I can put it that way, not just to repeat the word purpose, that dimension of moral importance as part of the conception of purpose. So I don't think that purposes all have to be of that kind, like providing people with the health care to which they are entitled. So that would, but that would be one element of one dimension of purpose. The issue about I don't want to take a position on a kind of bottom line position on the Facebook question that Jen asked, but the issue is what I do want to say is that the point is that this way of thinking about good jobs may help you to clarify the question. So there are lots of people who work at Facebook, who have worked, who do still. And I think when they think about the question, do I have a good job? At least part of what they think about is what's the impact of Facebook's effort to, quote, organize all the world's people, not just all the world's information, but all the world's people. Am I serving a good purpose in doing that? And so it's partly by answering that question that people answer the question about whether the job is a good job or not simply by looking at the, either about compensation or about the complexity of the work, the pleasure in the work itself. I know people who used to work at Facebook. They thought this is a fantastic place to work in all sorts of ways. It's just that I was making the world worse. So it wasn't a very good job.
The next question is for you, Matt. So it's from Carl, and it was about your answer about sweatshops. And so Carl was expressing some skepticism about your portrayal of sweatshop labor as a response to desperate poverty, because the thought was that those conditions of poverty didn't just happen to exist, but rather you might think it was caused by colonialism or neocolonial forces, which sort of intentionally created a very lopsided situation of ownership, which then forces billions of people into desperate poverty, partly so that they would accept sweatshop labor. So the question is, do you think that like the source or the origin of poverty plays a role in your argument about sweatshop labor?
In the point I made earlier, I guess I didn't mean to be staking out any commitment to the sources of poverty, right? So, I mean, the point I wanted to make was that the reason people take sweatshop jobs is because they're desperately poor. If they were not desperately poor, they would have other, essentially better things to do with their time, right? More better compensated tasks. They'd be more likely to send their kids to school instead of to work. So that unless something is done about the poverty, first of all, eliminating sweatshop jobs isn't going to make people better off. And I guess the flip side of that is one of the best ways to eliminate sweatshop jobs or improve them is to do something to address the poverty. And that's true, I think, whether the poverty is right, natural, if that's a thing, right, due to just sort of underdevelopment, or whether it's the product of colonialist policy. Now, I think, questions about moral culpability and responsibility do become more complicated once you start asking questions about who is responsible, right? So, if you're drowning, if you're stuck in a pool of quicksand and I happen to walk by with a rope in my hand and offer to pull you out for $100, that's a nasty thing to do. We call that exploitation, but it's a different kind of nasty thing to do than if I shove you in the quicksand, right, and then offer to pull you out for $100. And so, if the point is that what sweatshops are doing is more like that latter thing than like that former thing, then maybe you want to describe what's going on here as more along the lines of coercion rather than merely mutually beneficial exploitation. And perhaps that colors the way in which we'd want to shape our policy responses to those behaviors. And maybe it shapes the way in which we think that multinational enterprises have a duty to bear significant costs to correct or mitigate the problems with which they're dealing. The agency issues here are really complicated, right? So I think, probably what's going on in a lot of cases is you have multinational enterprises that are benefiting from previous injustice, but that are not themselves responsible for that previous injustice. And then the question of what their responsibility is to do something from it or to not benefit in particular ways from that injustice, then those issues become a lot more difficult. I have a paper on structural exploitation where I try to get at some of those issues, but it's they're thorny, and I don't think I settle them by any means in the paper.
So the next question is for you, Josh, and it's from Tom, and it's a question about compensation and a sort of a classic, one of the classical economic models about compensation. So according to some classical economic models, a worker's productivity determines their compensation, the compensation that they receive. Now, often when we think about compensation, it's like the wage you've earned or the paycheck. But you've outlined various other good-making features of jobs, and it seems like we could think of those other features, those other good-making features, as also being part of a package of total compensation. And so the question is, like, to what extent do you think that that economic model that hooks up workers' productivity to their compensation fits in with your view about all these good-making features of jobs? So what extent does a worker's productivity constrain to the extent to which jobs can be enjoyable?
A couple of thoughts on this complicated, interesting question. First, I'm a little bit uneasy. I sort of try, the idea in the paper is to distinguish these different dimensions. And I worry a little bit about saying, you know, as you're distinguishing the dimensions, this goes back again to that lovely phrase of Matt's earlier about the axiology before the economics. And as you're distinguishing the dimensions, somebody says, but can't they all be, you know, put under a common label, whether it's all compensation or they're all good. And yeah, okay, that's fine. But I'm not sure how helpful that is. They seem like really, in some ways, discrete goods, and I want to get them out as discrete. Now, that said, I do think that this goes back to the policy issue. One of the reasons that it's important to have policies, again, I think like a minimum wage policy or active labor market policies or R&D investment, is if you're going to pay people a living wage, not just a poverty, but a living wage. I mean, out here in Santa Clara Valley, I'm in San Francisco, not Santa Clara. In Santa Clara Valley, living wage for a family of 3 is about $60,000. If you're going to pay people a living wage, you are concerned about making sure that the work is more productive. And but in order to do that, you may require being, kicked from a low road where you're paying low compensation onto a higher road. And you may need, this is why, governments make R&D investments, because for externalities reasons, firms don't like to make the R&D investments, the investments in knowledge and innovation that may be required in order to make the work more productive, so that the compensation that you're paying, say if you're paying a living wage, is warranted by the work that's being done. So yes, the productivity is important, but I think precisely because it is, I think there's a case for the kind of policy engagements that I described that enable you to get the good jobs externalities. I'm not sure if I captured all of the question, but that's, and just one last point on this. The idea I mentioned the idea of, taking the William Morris idea of taking pleasure in the work itself, and I mentioned the Oldham Hackman job characteristic theory. Their view is that the kinds of features that I associate with jobs that give you pleasure in the work itself, those are more highly motivating. So pleasure in the work itself may sound like a nice to have rather than something that's really important. But if you think of pleasure in the work itself as making the work more motivating, it doesn't have to be intrinsically motivating, but it's more motivating, then by having jobs that provide pleasure in the work itself, you may be enhancing the productivity of the jobs in ways that make it more sustainable to pay a kind of a decent, say, living wage level of compensation.
Matt, we have a question for you about UBI. So there's a number of people were interested in sort of a cluster of related questions about UBI and about one of the touted benefits of UBI, which is that sometimes people say that UBI will empower workers, or they will give workers greater bargaining power by giving them the ability to walk away from bad jobs, or to give them time to make better decisions about what jobs to take. The question is, what's the evidence for this? Do you think that's right, or do you think that UBI might end up just being a subsidy for employers who would then pay a depressed wage? Or do you think, on the other hand, that it would be a vehicle for potential employees to bargain for better terms of employment?
Yeah, I do agree with that point. I think, and I don't see how the argument that it's going to lead to lower wages on the part of employers is supposed to work. Though I've heard that argument made a few times. I think if you think that workers' wages are a function of their productivity and their options, then it looks like if anything, it should drive wages up insofar as workers now have other better options besides employment that they can partake of. So you need to pay them more to lure them to your place of employment. So I think it does provide people with an option, with a greater ability to say no. Obviously, the vector of that, the magnitude of that ability depends on how big the basic income is. We do have some empirical evidence on this, right? There have been a number of studies, some larger, some smaller, on different cash transfer systems. There were a series of experiments in the United States on the negative income tax in the 60s and 70s, 70s and 80s. There was a income experiment in Canada. And usually what you see in these experiments is that people, for instance, take longer between jobs, right? So, there's the period of unemployment after leaving one job and before entering the next one is longer, suggesting very strongly that people are taking more time to look for a job that seems a good fit to them. People stay in school longer, right? So they're more inclined to purchase more education with their time rather than feeling driven to go right out and to join the labor market. Right. So, and then this is all what you would expect from just a kind of a priori view, right? If you've got more money, then you don't need to accept any particular job or necessarily any job at all as urgently as you would if you had less money. So, in that sense, giving people more money gives them more options.
Thank you so much. So, we have plenty more questions, but unfortunately we are out of time. So I'm going to pass things back to Simone.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we can't applaud our speakers, but we can at least give them virtual cheers. It's been a wonderful conversation. Thank you for the opportunity to think about jobs, good jobs, labor, and especially for the opportunity to make imaginative visits, at least to Central Park, which is one of the wonders of this country.